Thank you. Let me start that over again. Good morning, members and audience participants. I want to welcome you to the Joint Legislative Audit Committee. This is our second audit committee for this legislative year, and I want to strongly encourage all members to quickly report to room 444 so that we can establish a quorum and the hearing can commence. In the meantime, we will start as a subcommittee, and I want to let people know that this committee hearing is not like our normal committee hearings. We have asked, in addition to having the state auditor give her normal update on the status of pending audit request, I've asked the auditor to also provide for the committee a highlight of the single audit report results that were released today as of 9 o'clock this morning, and a highlight of her office's analysis of all the federal stimulus funds that California is set to receive and which programs are being deemed by the auditor's office to be at high risk of not having the controls necessary to make sure that California can handle the receipt of those federal stimulus funds and that we have the accountability and oversight in place that we need prior to receiving those federal stimulus funds. So with that, I'd like to welcome the state auditor, and Ms. Howell, you may start your presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is this on? Yeah. First of all, I'd like to start out with just a discussion. There is a document in your binder, members. There should be a tab. I think it's named Testimony, and it's a document. I am not going to read it in its entirety, but it will give you some specific detail about the single audit, which I will go over at a very high level today, and then talk a little bit about some of the analysis we've been doing to determine the efforts we need to undertake as far as work we're going to do regarding the stimulus, how we're going to link that into our ongoing single audit work, and then certainly some of the areas of risk that we think we need to pay attention to over the course of the next 6 to 9 months, which we believe is a critical window. But let me start out with the single audit. This document that I have in front of me is the actual single audit report that we issued this morning at 9 o'clock. What the single audit is a combination of an audit of the state's financial statements, which we issue an opinion on the state's financial statements for a variety of reasons. Certainly one important reason is bond rating agencies use it to rate the state's financial condition and to determine the bond rating, and certainly that affects our ability to borrow and issue bonds at certain rates. The majority of this document is the federal compliance work. And what the federal compliance work is under the single audit is California on an annual basis receives significant amounts of money. Everyone talks about the stimulus money coming into California. We're going to receive hopefully over $80 billion. On an annual basis, in the traditional single audit, California receives $80 billion annually for traditional federal programs, and my office is required by law to conduct the single audit. We are an independent external audit entity, as you know. That's what the federal government requires, that this audit work be done by an independent entity. We are that entity for California.
Ms. Howell, if I can just stop you for a moment. I noticed that we have a quorum, and if I could just ask the Secretary to call the roll.
Huber.
Here.
Here. Kodo. Duval. Here. Evans. Garrick.
Here.
Here. Hagman. Here. Monning. Ashburn. Cogdill. Here. Ducheney. Dutton. Padilla. Here. Wiggins. Here. Wolk. Here.
We have a quorum. Sure.
Thank you very much.
Certainly. So as I was saying, the federal compliance work, we're looking at a variety of federal programs in California. There's certain requirements that the Federal Office of Management and Budget, it puts out requirements. In fact, it issued requirements yesterday for this next year's single audit. But those requirements really guide how state agencies should be implementing federal programs, and certainly how independent audit shops should be conducting the audit work, and how we should be testing state agencies in their administration of federal programs. In the document, I mentioned two specific things that we look at when we're conducting federal compliance work. One is internal controls, looking at the accounting controls. What controls do the state agencies have in place to make sure that funds are spent appropriately? Eligible recipients are receiving funds. Payments are going out for legitimate purposes, allowable costs, the types of things that the federal regulations allow for. The other piece of federal compliance is, are we complying with federal rules and regulations? Some of these may be reporting requirements, again, eligibility requirements, timeliness of payments, those sorts of things. So for a variety of federal programs, my staff have a presence in several state agencies in California on an annual basis, looking at accounting controls, looking at federal compliance requirements and eligibility. So a summary of the report that we put out this morning, and this covers fiscal year July 1st, 07 through June 30th, 08. The single audit traditionally, and I'm going to talk about this, how this is going to change for us this year, traditionally is done after the fact, after many of the expenditures are already out the door. So this last year, California received nearly $87 billion in federal monies. The vast majority of those funds came in for a couple of areas. Education, as you would expect, received $38.7 billion, and Health and Human Services programs received $30.5 billion. When we looked at the federal programs, following the guidance that Washington puts out, we audited 39 major federal programs, or what are called program clusters. A cluster may be several small programs that have similar requirements. They cluster them together, so we cover all of those programs. An example would be at the Employment Development Department, Workforce Investment Act has a program for dislocated workers, a program for youth, a program for adult. The feds cluster that all together and ask us to audit all three programs. So that's an example of a cluster. So these 39 programs that we audited last year, the amount of dollars for those 39 programs totaled $72 billion. So of the $87 billion that the state received, we looked at programs administering about 82% of those monies. So it's great coverage, and this should provide some assurance to the legislature, to the public in California, that many of the programs that California administers, we're looking at. We're looking at controls. We're looking at compliance. And this ties into the Recovery Act, because many of the programs for which California will be receiving recovery dollars are those same programs that we've been auditing on an annual basis for the last 15, 20 years. So much of what we look at in the single audit will also help us assess whether or not California is well prepared to administer the federal programs. So in the single audit, this report, we have about 138 findings. Some of those findings cover a variety of different requirements. There's an attachment in the testimony document that lists 14 different requirements. It's right after, let me get to the page number here. So it's on page 10. So this is a listing of the general requirements that the federal government asks us to evaluate whether or not the state, any state in the United States, but California we're focusing on certainly, if we're complying with these different requirements. And a couple of examples I already mentioned are activities allowed or allowable costs. Are we expending these funds for the types of activities that the federal government wants us to use those monies for? Eligibility I mentioned. How do we determine who are those groups or individuals who are going to receive these funds? Are we making sure that we're complying with the federal eligibility requirements? Another important one is item number 12 and 13, reporting requirements. As we've all heard under the Recovery Act, there are additional reporting requirements. What we know by doing the single audit is how well some of these state agencies are reporting the traditional things that they're expected to report. Typically, they're expected to report expenditures on a quarterly basis, number of recipients, those types of things. So we are looking at those things. Subrecipient monitoring is a requirement that state agencies go out to locals, LEAs, community-based organizations, and do some random audits to make sure that the subrecipients are meeting the expectations. So when the state awards a grant or awards funding out at the local level, we have certain requirements that we expect those CBOs and the locals to comply with. That's what we're testing. We're testing to see, is the state agency that is administering that program making sure that the subrecipients who receive funds are using those appropriately. So those are the types of compliance requirements that we're testing. In the single audit that we published today, again, I indicated we had 138 findings. We had more than 200 material or significant deficiencies. We have on our website, and we have attached, again, to my testimony, some sample pages from our website. We created a section on our website that will allow members, staff, the general public, anyone to go in and look at. If you page back after page 10 is the beginning of various pages from our website that we've printed out. It gives a little bit of background about the State Auditor's Office, but if you flip in a few pages, you can see that you can use drop-down menus to say, I'm interested in the Department of Education. I want to know all the programs that the State Auditor looked at for the Department of Education. Where did we identify weaknesses, both in internal controls and compliance? And then we have some summaries by department. So we list all of the departments. I don't have page numbers, but if you flip in about 4 or 5 pages, there is a summary page. It's called Compliance and Internal Control Summary. I don't know if you folks have been able to get to that. What that shows you is a listing of the departments for which we conducted single audit work. And then there's a couple of columns that at this point, what the governor's office is estimating California will receive in stimulus dollars. And then there's a couple of other columns to the right, which is the results of this year's single audit. So what this is telling you is these departments that we've audited, some of them are estimated to receive stimulus dollars, and based on our single audit work, we've identified some deficiencies both in internal control and compliance requirements. So we have a head start. California is being very proactive, obviously. Yes, Department of Education has a lot of issues. Part of that is because they have a lot of programs that they administer. Now, if you were on the website, you could click on the Department of Education and it would tell you all 24, which programs those 24 material weaknesses are in. The significant weaknesses are not as severe. So when you're looking at material, that's a significant weakness, something we are very concerned about. Significant, again, is not something as material as the other column. And same thing, instances of noncompliance. The majority of them for education are in the less severe category, but still things we need to pay attention to and need to follow up and conduct some corrective action. And that's what state agencies are required to do. Once we've issued this report, they work with the Department of Finance. Department of Finance has a significant role in helping state agencies address these issues and collaborating and coordinating with the federal government as to what the state's doing to correct many of these findings. So each agency has to submit a corrective action plan. Finance reviews that plan, and I think that's a very important role that the administration, through the Department of Finance and their auditors, plays in making sure that California is doing everything it can to comply with the requirements and tighten up our controls. There are a variety of both statewide issues in the single audit report and issues specific to individual departments.
At what point would you like us to start next?
Since you've addressed the single audit portion of the audit, or portion of your report, you still have to cover the high-risk analysis. And I'm thinking that we'll wait until after she covers the high-risk analysis, and then we'll allow questions. I have Mr. Hagman and Mr. Garrick also. Okay.
I can take just a few more minutes. That's kind of the high-level results of the single audit. Certainly, we have a lot of information on the website that will categorize it if you're interested in a particular federal program, particular state department, et cetera. Now, planning ahead for single audit work we're going to do for fiscal year 8-9. We're almost at the end of fiscal year 8-9. Excuse me. We have already commenced the single audit for that particular year, and we do that because we have a specific deadline that we have to meet for the federal government, and there are certain things we can do early, and a lot of that is that internal control testing, following up again on some of the findings we've identified in prior years. This last year, as I indicated, we audited 39 programs. This coming year for 8-9, it's looking like we're conducting estimates because the decision to audit programs is based on the receipts coming into California. We're doing an analysis. We have information up through the end of May or the middle of May. and we'll project that out through the end of this year to identify. But at our first estimate at this point, it's looking like we're going to have to audit 41 programs for this next fiscal year, the 8-9 single audit. 31 of those we looked at in this report, so we already have a huge heads up. 10 of those programs that we did not audit in this report that we issued today, those will be programs that perhaps we've audited in the past, because some programs we may not necessarily audit on an annual basis, particularly programs that do not have significant weaknesses. One agency I will tell you that we typically go into and we have findings, but not significant findings, is the Department of Transportation. We think they do a good job of administering federal programs. You'll see there's a table in my testimony. I'll get you to it in a second. It's on page 4. And this is an example of some departments. Again, you'll see some similar numbers here. Education, I took you to that other table that showed our deficiencies in our noncompliance, our federal stimulus. Drop down to the Department of Transportation. At this point, the website, the governor's office website's not indicating they're going to receive funds in 8-9. We think that might be in error. We're not sure. We're checking with finance. But certainly there's going to be a significant amount of stimulus money coming in 9-10. If you look across, we only had one issue with the Department of Transportation. So again, that's an example of an agency that we think has pretty strong controls in place and does a good job of administering programs. And those are the kinds of analyses that we'll be doing as far as assessing risk. If you flip to page 5 of my testimony, I'm going to step you through a few examples of how we assess risk. There's 3 different categories here. The first 2 items are programs audited with identified deficiencies. So this is Title I, Department of Education, and special education grants. As you can see from the first column, we're projecting that they will receive funds, traditional single audit, traditional federal program, $1.4 billion. If you carry it over and look at the Recovery Act, the next 2 columns, it's looking like California is going to receive another $1.4 billion. So essentially in a 2-year window, this program is going to double. So in an auditor's mind, that's high risk. Have we had deficiencies? We've audited this program in the last couple of years, and we have had deficiencies, as you saw in our summary table. Special education, very similar. The next category down are programs we haven't audited within the last couple of years. Those are the types of programs that are on a cycle. They cycle off if we consider them low risk. Why would we consider a program that's getting $4 billion like food stamps low risk? Because we've audited it in the past and we've found that the controls are good. We haven't had issues with that particular program. But you need to cycle it in every few years. So we haven't looked at it in a couple of years. Therefore, and it's also receiving stimulus money, we need to audit that program this year. That's another example. Highway planning and construction, as I said, Caltrans does a nice job. They get $3 billion, but again, they're going to receive some stimulus money. We need to rotate them back in. The bottom 2, programs with significant increases of monies due to influx of recovery funds. These are 2 examples of programs that traditionally in the single audit, the state of California does not receive a significant amount of money. That's $3 million for the state energy program. But lo and behold, in fiscal year 9-10 under the Recovery Act, that department, which is the Energy Commission, is going to be managing $239 million of stimulus dollars. So that's a significant increase. That's an agency, because it only receives $3 million, it would not be on our radar screen, quite frankly, when we're conducting the single audit. But now that becomes a high-risk program because of the significance of the money coming into California. We may go into the Energy Commission and find very strong controls. We may not, but we need to know now. So that's why we're planning to do some upfront work. Even though those dollars are going to be spent in 9-10 and the single audit process, we wouldn't audit that till next spring. We need to audit the internal controls, do a very focused review of their controls now so that we can let the Energy Commission know this is what you need to tighten up so that those expenditures in California are well invested in the appropriate projects, et cetera. So those are this is just an example on page 5 of the type of risk assessment that we have been doing in determining what programs to audit as part of the single audit, and then some front-end work, as we may call it, just some very focused internal control testing that we do over the next 6 or 9 months for those programs that, again, are going to receive significant dollars in the next couple of years. So that's kind of a high-level explanation of our risk assessment. So our action plan: conduct the traditional single audit, do some of this internal control work. We're going to issue periodic reports on those internal control reviews that we do to give the administration that information so they can take swift action. The administration is very committed. I've had conversations with the task force, and we've met with some individuals from finance, because they certainly want to be able to help the agencies address any concerns that we identify and correct those as soon as possible. And we certainly are coordinating with GAO, which is the Government Accountability Office, which will have a presence in California for the next 2 years, because they have some major responsibilities under the Recovery Act. Federal Inspectors General, same thing. They will be doing, we've actually met with the Inspectors General for the Department of Education. They are going to be doing a fair amount of work out at the local level, but relying on our single audit work that we do at the Department of Education. And we also have a meeting this Friday with the U.S. Department of Transportation Federal Inspectors General. So we're starting to coordinate and collaborate with the Inspectors General, who have a significant role in the Recovery Act. The last piece, and then I will certainly do my best to answer any questions you have. An important element of the Recovery Act relates to fraud, waste, and abuse. And we have, I'm hopeful that in my testimony, in pages 7 and 8, of the document, it gives you a high-level overview of what the Recovery Act requires with regard to whistleblower protections, investigations of any retaliation. The main entities responsible for conducting these kinds of investigations are the Federal Inspectors General. They were specifically identified in the Recovery Act. There's also a Recovery Accountability and Transparency Board that has a role, but certainly the Federal Inspectors General, because they have very broad authority. They can go in and audit private contractors, local entities, do work at the state level. What my office has, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is in California, my office manages we're responsible for implementing the California Whistleblower Protection Act. Our jurisdiction is limited to state employees. So we have reached out. We now are coordinating with all the Federal Inspectors General in California that have investigative authority and responsibility. We're in the process of establishing protocols internally to prioritize any complaints that we receive, so that if we receive a complaint that's not within our jurisdiction, we know the appropriate Inspector General at the federal level to refer that complaint to, or that complainant to, so people that call my office don't get frustrated, because based on our experience in managing the Whistleblower Act, we get about 400 or 500 calls a month. Many of those are not within our jurisdiction. So we have a listing of federal agencies, local agencies that we can refer people to, because we don't want complainants to be frustrated. So we have established those protocols. We also are working with the Transparency Board at the federal level and the Federal Inspectors General to develop protocols for exchanging information, because they're looking to us to assist them in conducting investigations at the state level, because we certainly have the jurisdiction to audit state employees that may be accused of improper activity, et cetera. So to relieve some of their pressure on the federal IGs, they're actually quite pleased that we have this capacity or capability in our office, and that we have the responsibility. And certainly the legislature, in enacting that Whistleblower Protection Act, has put in very strong provisions as far as protecting anonymity of complainants, et cetera. So just to let you know, that's another element of the Recovery Act work that my office will be engaged in. So with that, I will do my best to answer any questions you might have.
Before we do questions, there's just one more piece that I'd like you to address in your presentation, and that's where the Joint Legislative Audit Committee fits into the prioritization of the work that you're doing. I think it's great work that you're doing on the high-risk analysis, making sure that we know where the federal stimulus dollars are going and we know what controls are in place in those programs. But given that your office has limited resources, can you talk a little bit about where our prioritizations as a committee fits in to the work that you're doing?
Certainly. We want to be able to continue to do as many legislative requested audits as possible. When I go through my status and the number of resources that we have available, I have pulled back some of those resources to dedicate them to some of the work that we're going to have to do on the Recovery Act. But I still feel that we do have some resources available for this committee and the legislature to be able to ask us to do some work. One of the suggestions could be that this committee may be interested in asking us to do some audits that are specifically related to stimulus or the agencies that are receiving stimulus dollars. As we go through more analysis of the work we're going to do under the single audit, we certainly can share some of that information. But I think the committee could assist in prioritizing what is the interest of the legislature and the legislative members as far as the limited resources, unfortunately, that we will have for the audit committee. We will have resources. I want to assure you of that. But I did have to make some adjustments. We also had, and I'll go over that when I go through my statuses, a couple of statutory audits that we have to have done by the end of this calendar year. So again, that pulls a couple of supervisors away from our discretionary work that we'd like to do for the legislature. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. And I do want to thank your office has been very clear in saying that whatever the legislature directs, of course, you will do. And so I appreciate the deference that you give to the legislature in this process. And I hope that through the questions that we can all come up with some priorities in this committee. And I have Mr. Hagman. You still have a question?
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thanks. Just from being a recipient of federal dollars in the past for the Workforce Investment Board, I also noticed that if you don't do things a certain way, that generally financial penalties are taken. Either you spend that money for things you thought you could spend it for and you have to repay it, or you have to redo the services. And if all these material significant potential situations with some of the federal dollars, I guess a couple multi-part. Can you confirm what the monetary penalties could be for things like our education or the Health and Services Department where we took those funds? And if we had to pay anything in the past, are we looking at anything for your annual audit that may be affecting our budget or bottom line here later? And then the second one is, it's nice to see a snapshot this last year, but is there a possibility to show for the ones you continue to audit to see by categories, so you see this, if there's a pattern in a particular department or a particular funding stream that could be beneficial to help us maybe correct the situation or to come down on that particular department and see what we can do to help them do their job better so we don't have the same problems.
Mm-hmm. I'll answer the second question first because that one I think will be a little bit easier to answer. On the website we have this year's single audit that we just published and last year's, and we will have, I'm not sure it's up yet, but we're going to have a side-by-side comparison so you will be able to tell, for example, at Employment Development Department, which administers the WIA program, that Workforce Investment Act, did we have the same audit finding from one year to the next? Also, in the back of the single audit report, there is an entire section of previous year findings. And what that section will tell you is when was the first year we reported that particular finding. And by identifying that, you can say, wow, this issue has been an issue for the state of California for multiple number of years. A perfect example is Department of Education and cash management. In fact, the federal IG for U.S. Department of Education issued a report in March of this year and cited our single audit and said the state auditor has reported cash management as an issue for the Department of Education for 6 consecutive years. And cash management, with regard to that particular finding, is the state draws down the money from the federal government. What cash management federal requirements say is we can't sit on that money and earn interest on it as a state, and certainly when it's distributed to the LEAs, they need to make sure that those funds are expended within a certain amount of time. If they don't, that interest earned has to be reverted back to the federal government. So that's a finding that we've had for multiple years. So you can go to the back of any of the single audit reports and see the repeat findings and when we initially reported that finding. Now, some of them, there's a statewide issue that is going to be very difficult for the state of California to correct anytime soon, and it's related to our accounting system. The federal government requires states to present what's called a schedule of federal financial assistance. It's in this report. It lists all the federal programs for which California receives funds. There's over 300 federal programs. Many of them are very small. If we're looking at 39 programs out of 300 and we're covering 82% of the dollars, that tells you a lot of these programs are very small. That schedule of federal financial assistance is supposed to be presented based on expenditures. But our accounting system here in California does not allow us to do that. So we present that schedule based on receipts coming into California. And that's been a finding, I think, since we started the single audit, probably back in '85. The Fiscal project is the intent. That's Finance's response to that issue, that we understand that's an issue. We've communicated with the feds. We've talked to the federal government. We say we're going to have that finding until we're able to develop a new system. That's one that's difficult to correct until we get a new accounting system. But there are other findings in here that we just need to just stay on top, and I think this is where finance can play an important role. And certainly I've talked to the Inspector General, Laura Chick, about this too. This is something, in my personal opinion, is where she could assist as well, is let's identify these findings and prioritize those that we really feel we need to address as soon as possible, that are the most important, and just make sure that we consistently, collectively as an accountability community, make sure these agencies, and that's how the legislature could certainly provide oversight as well, in saying these are the high priority issues, these are findings we've reported year after year, we need to get these issues fixed so that we can demonstrate California's being proactive, and stimulus dollars, we can find comfort in sending that money to California because it will be used appropriately.
We do need to move along, but I just wanted to let all the committee members know that the Inspector General, Laura Chick, will be here at the next JLAC hearing on June 24th to talk about some of this follow-up, so maybe we can get into it in more detail at that time. Assemblymember Garrick?
I just have a follow-up comment.
Okay,
Thank you,
quickly.
Madam Chair. So I say it would be wonderful information to have go to the respective committees for the oversight part, like the education finding audits go there and that sort of thing, so that can be followed up in their committees. Thank
Sure.
you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Amazing numbers here I'm looking at. $87 billion in federal funds spread out over 323 different programs, with $38 billion of that spent in education and $30 billion in health programs. In this audit that you're sharing with us, you audited 39 major federal programs, which makes up 82%. So basically, close to 10% of the programs make up 80% of the spending.
That's correct.
Just in summary. The concerns I have come on the next page, page 3, where we found 26 of the 58 counties CSOC had audited. When we talk about forwarded the reports and corrective action plans, can you tell me a little bit about the corrective action plans, or in other words, what type of follow-up is there? When I'm looking at your later single audit findings of 08, and I'm looking at education with 24 internal control deficiencies and of material significance, and 76 of significance instances of noncompliance. I'm looking at a total of 53 identified instances of noncompliance versus transportation. I'm looking at 1.
Right.
Those are shocking comparisons in terms of the numbers. Can you tell me what type of follow-up or is there to the corrective action plans, and maybe discuss the corrective action plans a little bit as to what you offer in those corrective action plans?
Certainly. First of all, on page 3 of my testimony, the portion that you're referring to, the 26 of 58 counties, this is actually additional single audit work that is done over and above the work that we do at the state level. So at the local level, if an entity receives in excess of a certain dollar amount, and I think it's $500,000, they're required to have their own single audit. So a local government agency will report that information to the State Controller's Office. So the State Controller's Office receives all of these single audit reports, reviews them for a couple of reasons. Make sure that the audit followed appropriate standards, and that they can certify that this single audit was conducted appropriately. Then what they do is they review that single audit and they say, there are findings in this audit report, and these are specific to the Department of Education. So the controller has to certify it complies with standards, and then send it to the Department of Education along with the corrective action plan that is included. The corrective action plan is basically, when you look at our single audit report, we make a recommendation, the agency has to respond, this is what we're going to do to fix it, and give us a timeline. Sometimes they give us a specific timeline, sometimes they don't. But they should be providing time frames. So the correct...
Let me interrupt.
Sure.
How quickly do you require a response? And do you just identify the problem when they don't seem to even respond? What action is taken? 30-day turnaround, give us a plan in 30 days how you're going to correct it, or you give them 6 months? What type of...
No, corrective action plan has to be submitted. I don't know the specific time frame, but it has to be submitted. The response that we get from the agencies is our traditional, we give them 4 or 5 days to look at the audit finding. But what I want you to keep in mind is we're conducting this single audit on an annual basis every single year. So many of these departments, we're in there almost all year round. We're in there probably 9 months out of the year. So they're very familiar because many times we're looking at the same program year after year. So when we're identifying a problem, we let them know immediately so they can start beginning working on the corrective action plan long before they have an official audit finding. But the other part of this is the Department of Finance. The response to this big document came from the Department of Finance, because Finance is the central control agency for all the state agencies as far as the single audit. Mm-hmm. So they are what we call the cognizant, where they're working with the federal government to let the feds know, yes, we're working on these issues, we know this needs to be corrected, we're communicating with all these state agencies. So that's what's happening at the state level. The ones that come in from the counties, the concern we have here are two. One is the individual state departments need to make sure that they're following up with the local entities to get those corrective action plans and to make sure that those plans are implemented. It's one thing to have a corrective action plan. It's another thing to implement it.
Exactly.
And then the other concern, as we have in that last bullet, these audit reports and corrective action plans, the state is required to make a decision, essentially say, yes, we've received your corrective action plan, we've received your audit report, we've certified the report, we think your corrective action plan is okay, it's appropriate. We have to make that decision within 6 months. But if the controller is not getting the report to a state agency for 9 months, we're not going to meet that 6-month window. So there's two pieces. The controller needs to do a better job of getting those audit reports in, certifying they're good, getting them over to the state agency. That state agency needs to get on top of that local entity. Now, there are some audit reports in our finding in our single audit that come in that the controller says, this is not sufficient audit work, and communicates back to that local entity to say, single audit's not meeting our standards or the standards expected of the federal government, you got to do it again, or you've got to beef it up, go back and do some additional testing. So that's another piece of this. But this finding is specific to the federal government expects decisions to be made within 6 months, and that's not happening in all cases. So this is single audit work at the local level.
And we are going to talk about some of this follow-up and how we're making sure that these recommendations are implemented at the next hearing with the Inspector General, Laura Chick, who does have some of the jurisdiction over that issue. So if we could move it along. I do have Senator Wolk has a question as well.
Yes, just briefly. Good morning, Ms.
Morning.
I had one question or two about, this is not a page number, the high-risk federal programs that you've listed, the state energy program and the weatherization assistance.
Oh, that table, okay.
Yeah, and you talked about which department or departments or commission. You're looking only at the Energy Commission?
Well, that's my understanding thus far. I don't know, because what we'll need to do is for that federal program, those two federal programs, state energy and weatherization, determine if there are more than one state agency. If there is more than one state agency that administers, then we'd have to go to both places.
All right.
My just, again, high-level understanding at this point is Energy Commission has a big role in these. There may be other departments that are involved as well. That's part of our assessment in determining how many departments we're going to need to visit with regard to any of the federal programs, because some are administered by a variety of departments.
Okay. And the timing of that?
The timing, that's when I was talking about this next six to 9 month window. I think between now and the end of this calendar year, for these types of agencies that are going to receive significant dollars in our state fiscal year 9-10, July through June, we need to get in there soon and do, again, very focused internal control work. We're not going to test compliance because they won't be administering the program yet, but we want to look at controls to make sure that those are in place so that when they do start administering the program, they're doing a good job of it and they have the proper controls in place. So that focused control work we'll be doing over the next 6 months.
Okay, let me follow up with that. On the noncompliance summary, subrecipient monitoring is pretty large.
Right.
What systems do we have in place to do this kind of monitoring?
Well,
is it department by department and just,
Yeah, it varies by
choose-
department. So, for example, one of the findings I was reading through this morning, Employment Development Department is supposed to do some subrecipient monitoring under Workforce Investment Act. There are different types of entities that receive those dollars. I'm not going to remember the acronym, but some of them are CBOs. And basically what they said, lucky for me, I flipped right to it.
Good plan.
There's local workforce investment areas as a recipient and CBOs. EDD did go out and audit and do the subrecipient monitoring on the local workforce investment groups, but they were not able to go out to the CBOs. Their explanation to us is they just didn't have the resources, the staffing to be able to do all of the monitoring, so they made these local workforce investment areas the higher priority. And then the Department of Education they call it a coordinated group, where they go out to a school district and they may audit a variety of federal programs that those school districts administer. Instead of having one team go in and test for Title I and then another team 2 weeks later come out and test for special ed, they do a coordinated effort where they have a team that goes out and tests for all the federal programs at one time. So it varies from department to department.
Well, just looking at this, I mean, employment EDD is something, given the results of your audits over time, don't seem to be doing the right thing. Whereas education and social services, the places where there's going to be a whole lot of money coming in,
Right.
we can't seem to get, or they can't seem to get out of this cash management issue,
Right.
subrecipient monitoring issue, and everything else. I think that's the kind of thing we're going to be talking about with Laura Chick.
Some of
So
that,
that's where
and some of it will be this committee deciding amongst all the different audit requests we get from the different members of the legislature whether the committee itself would like to do some additional audit work to make sure that we're following up on these programs that have been found deficient in the past and make sure that they're addressing some of those issues in conjunction with the Inspector General.
Yeah, because I see this in those cases. I mean, we don't need more audits. We need enforcement
Exactly.
and compliance.
Exactly. Right.
So that's really the issue for me.
Right, and one thing that we may be able
Thank
to do to assist the committee and respond to Mr. Hagman's question is go through and summarize. We have it on the website, but we could certainly put a summary document together of the issues we've had at the Department of Education. Cash management's been an issue. How long has it been an issue? What are some of the reasons the department is indicating to us they have not been able to correct that problem? And we could highlight specific agencies that this committee may be interested in and certainly assist the administration in directing their efforts, because we've got to, based on the resources in my office and certainly the administration, you've got to set your priorities as to where you're going to look, because there's so much to look at. But we could, to assist, I think that the website that we've put together, I'm very proud of that. I think that actually is cutting edge. I mean, we're sharing this with some of the other state audit shops because they feel it's a real educational tool for their members as well as for the public to demonstrate to the public that this money is being looked at, folks. But we could certainly summarize by certain departments that that you may want to highlight or direct us to do more work, or certainly assist the administration, Ms. Chick and Department of Finance, in saying we need you to get in there now and enforce some of these concerns that have been raised either by the state auditor or by GAO.
Madam Chair,
so-
that's certainly something I'd be interested in pursuing.
Great. And we can call those departments in to testify here at our next committee hearing. If once we decide what those priorities are as a committee, we can certainly help in that enforcement effort. We have 3 more questions, and both of our presenters are here on our audit request. So with that, Assemblymember Cotto, if you could be brief.
If I could be brief. Yeah. Maybe, let me see how I can make brief. Maybe I can, if you can just reinforce what I think I'm understanding about this.
Okay.
The key findings, when you looked at those clusters in the 19 state departments, the big issues appear to be deficiencies in internal controls.
That's correct.
As one. Second one is that the state is not complying with certain federal requirements.
That's correct.
The second one. And then when you look at all programs, and then it's a reflection of statewide issues. And in school districts, I would imagine possibility in all 1,000 school districts, or at least those that receive federal fundings. The big issues there are one of automated accounting system doesn't identify expenditures. That's
right. That's at the state level.
All right.
That's not at the local.
Not at the local level.
That's the state account. These bullets on page 3, that where we say that we reported issues that encompass all programs. This is work that we did at the state level. So our accounting system at the controller's office allows us to track receipts. But then once it's divvied up among all the different state departments, then that's where you lose the ability to track the expenditures.
And the same thing for the second part was that we don't have adequate written policies and procedures. Again, that's here at the state level.
Right. That's the cash management issue, where not only are we not doing a good job of making sure when we draw money down we get it out to the locals, but we're not properly calculating the interest owed to the federal government for those funds that we did not disperse promptly.
All right, and then the database is also an area that's problematic?
That's related to cost allocation. So what the federal government allows the state, certainly, and the Recovery Act is going to provide for this as well, is allows the state of California to say, well, it's going to cost us. There's going to be administrative costs to administer the program. So what the federal grants allow and the Recovery Act now will allow is the state to allocate some of those administrative costs to the grants to charge it back to the federal government. So the additional effort that we need to put in oversight and state agencies as far as administering the programs, we can charge that to the federal program. That's not going to be a cost to the state of California, to our general fund.
Thank you.
Mr. Monning and then Mr. Cogdell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, my question was asked by my colleague, Mr. Garrick, so I can save us some time.
Okay.
While I have the mic, though, I do just want to thank Ms. Howell and all your staff for managing. The scope is rather amazing to me, and particularly with this advent of stimulus dollars. And I just appreciate the clarity of your presentation and the scope of the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Cogdell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to, my question, I want to refer you back to page 4 again. And this is for the fiscal year ending June 30th. So my question is, as it relates to the education piece and the social services piece, the number of deficiencies and in the different categories, as well as the instances of noncompliance, are these typical numbers in these areas year to year, or is this an anomaly we're looking at?
This is for this current year, and if you looked back at the prior year, which again is on our website, and I doubt we have it in the packet, these numbers are fairly consistent with what we've seen in the last few years.
So when we talk about prioritization, and you mentioned the resources available, you will have them, but you also acknowledge that, like all resources, they are limited. To me, the glaring problem here is in education, primarily, given the dollars we're talking about. And it seems when we talk about as a committee where we want to focus our efforts, it's pretty obvious where we should be doing it. And if this has been going on now for years, and I suspect it has, again, it just points to the fact that that needs to be the area that we look at first and figure out what their problem is and get it straightened out. As you well know, they're also the biggest line item in the budget. They're where the money is. So when you're dealing with the difficulties that we are, I think the oversight and the accountability is more needed than it ever has been. So what are the problems there, I guess, just in a nutshell? Why do we have such huge amounts of deficiencies?
Boy, I don't know if I have the summary.
In that area?
Part of it is because we look at so many programs at the Department of Education, and honestly, I don't have that at the top of my head. But that's something we could summarize for you. I mean, we have cash management problems. Certainly, that's a major problem. It's a big concern for the federal government because when we met with the Inspector General for the Department of Education, the Federal Inspector General, as I said, they issued a report in March of this year about cash management, and that's all about, distributing the funds timely, not advancing monies too soon, not providing funding too late, so school districts are struggling. So they have significant concerns with cash management. Subrecipient monitoring is a concern. Again, I can't think of all of them off the top of my head. If I had the website up, I could click right on education and tell you all of them. But I certainly can. What we can do for this committee is summarize the issues for the Department of Education for not only this single audit, but the one we conducted last year, and give you a compilation of at least the last 2 years. If the committee needs us to go back further, we can do that. But I think the last 2 years will give you a good snapshot of what the issues are. And that's very easy to do.
Give us some kind of bang for the buck.
Sure.
Estimate here. I mean, how much are we losing as a result of the problems that we're having in
Right, and there may not necessarily be funds that we're losing, but certainly it would be areas of high risk and of concern to the federal government, that's for sure, because, again, we had our meeting with the federal IG for education, and they rely heavily on the single audit work that we do.
And if I could just jump in here really quickly, and we really do have to move on to our requesters. We will have the opportunity to ask the state auditor some additional questions during the presentation so that we can make those prioritizing decisions. But I just want to make sure that something isn't lost in there. There's the category of programs that are receiving large chunks of federal stimulus dollars that we know have problems, that we've audited before, that we really need some enforcement mechanisms for to make sure that those problems are getting corrected. And we may not necessarily need another audit, but we do need to make sure that those problems are being corrected. And then there's the programs that we've never audited before, which may not have as big of a price tag. They may not have received as much money in the past, but they are getting large chunks of money, and we don't know if they have the ability to control that money. They could have people that could write checks to themselves for $30 million. And that's another whole category of high risk that we could be prioritizing as this committee. It doesn't require the enforcement piece in the beginning, but it does require being proactive and looking at those programs to make sure that they have those internal controls. Is that your assessment?
You're a quick study. That's exactly what I was hoping I would convey in this presentation. Absolutely. There's different categories of risk.
I'm going to let really quickly Mr. Garrick and Mr. Duvall.
Mr. Cota also.
Go ahead. Go real quick. First, thank you again for your indulgence here. The summary that was offered, I'd like to sign up for that summary where you start a list. I'll sign at the top of it. Of the top 20 problems for both education and the health, those are the two that are consuming collectively $68 billion of $80 billion. The other is, could you tell us what, just a reflection of the past 2 years, what the interest that we've had to pay back to the feds, because we haven't had those in. You may not know it off the top of your head, but include it in that summary. If you have it on the top of your head, I'd appreciate it. And the last would be fiscal. Where do we stand with getting fiscal so we have tighter accounting controls and a more uniform system across the entire California government base?
You're testing me as far as the interest. I don't have that off the top of my head, but I will go back and talk to staff and see what we have as far as information. It probably in a variety of the findings in here, but we will do our best to get you that information. With regard to fiscal, we can also provide you information related to that because that is another project that we've been asked to monitor. So we've done a couple of very brief updates on the fiscal project. Again, off the top of my head, I don't know the status of that, but we do have audit staff, 2 or 3 people actually assigned to monitor that, and we've issued a couple of updates on the fiscal project, so I'm certainly happy to share that.
Any of the federal dollars to update or to expedite, not update, but to expedite the fiscal project that you just talked about, administrative chargebacks on the federal dollars that are shipped to us so that we could use those dollars to expedite.
Actually,
Mr. Garrick, I'm going to ask
I
that
don't know the answer to that.
so that we could move on. I'm going to ask. I know the auditor staff is here today, and that they are also available to come to your office to address specific questions. But if we can move on real quickly, Mr. Duvall and Mr. Cotto.
Simple question, I hope.
I hope.
When we're doing this for the federal compliance with the federal money, when we're in there auditing the education, when we got $58 billion from state dollars in there as well, are you doing these audits in sync with the state dollars and the Fed, or are you only concentrating on the Fed compliance?
We do a little bit of state compliance, if I'm understanding your question correctly.
Here's my point. If you're in there doing an audit on education, and we know the last 6 years have had all these problems, are we auditing all the monies? State and Fed.
Well, the controls that we're looking at usually are controls that that state agency uses regardless of whether it's state dollars or federal dollars.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
mine should also be very quickly. You just cited in this report the 2 Title I grant, Title I and the special education funding sources, which are the big ones. There's 56 categorical programs in the state. Do those other programs, in your estimate, each of them have different rules and regulations that have to be complied with, or are they pretty uniform across all of the programs?
The 14 requirements that we show on in my testimony on page 10 are pretty consistent across all federal programs, but then there may be additional requirements that are specific to an individual program. So we also test those. These 14 requirements are general requirements that typically an agency that's administering a federal program has to comply with most, if not all, of those 14.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. I think that really goes a long way in helping us to prioritize the audit requests that we receive as the Joint Legislative Audit Committee. And with that, we will go to our first request pending on today's agenda, and that is file item 2009106 by Senators Lowenthal and Huff regarding the California High-Speed Rail Authority. Senator Huff is here to present. The way that we'll handle the presentations is let me see. We do have time limits since we want to be as respectful to the request as we can, but get these done quickly. The author's office will be given 3 minutes to present, and then any representatives from the affected agencies will be given 2 minutes. Public comment will also be limited. The first person to speak will get 1 minute, and if each additional person could just state your name and whether you support or oppose the audit, we'd appreciate it. Thank you very much, Senator Huff.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. I will try to keep this as brief as Assemblyman Cotto's last comment or question. Senator Lowenthal and I are requesting this audit of the California High-Speed Rail Authority because we believe it's important to have an independent review of the authority's systems, so it's a systems audit request, for managing such a complex enterprise as developing something brand new in the state, that is a high-speed rail system for the state. The Senate Transportation and Housing Committee has held 4 informational hearings. And as a result of that, we've determined that an audit is necessary. In fact, the executive director of the authority has testified in our last hearing that he believes an audit would be of assistance to him. I ask for your aye vote.
Thank you. Do we have anybody from the High-Speed Rail Authority to speak?
Do we just move this regular? Move the audit? Move the audit?
It does require a motion and a second.
All right.
Good morning, Madam Chairman. My name is Mehdi Morshid. I'm the Executive Director of High Speed Rail Authority. And the authority is very proud of the work we've done over the last 10 years. I think we've accomplished a great deal with the very limited resources, and we'll be happy to have an auditor look at it and assess whether or not we have done the good thing. I think we have, and if we haven't, find out what we haven't and correct it. So we don't have any problem or any issues with the request for audit.
Thank you. I know we have another member who would like to speak on this audit. I'm going to allow the auditor to speak first on her assessment of the audit, and then allow anybody who's speaking. Are you speaking in support or opposition? Opposition, correct? Right. That's what I thought. Okay. The auditor, please.
Okay, very quickly, members, I'll go through the scope and objectives. The first question we've been asked to look at is just the structure of the authority. Has it been well structured to be able to administer and manage bond proceeds that it will receive in the future when they issue bonds? What processes, again, and controls have they put in place? Looking at project management, what structure have they put together to make sure that they're managing projects, ensuring that the scope, budget, and schedule for each of those projects stays on track, and that they're doing a good job of monitoring that. Looking at their strategic plan. We know that they do have a strategic plan. What are the goals and objectives that they've established in that plan? How do they intend to measure how successful they are in meeting each of those goals and objectives? Looking at funding sources, just identifying the funding sources over a 3-year window. That should be relatively easy to do. Looking at their contracting practices. Much of their expenditures thus far have been for contracts, and the members requesting the audit are interested in us identifying how they go about awarding, monitoring contracts, and then actually taking a sample of some contracts and assessing their payment procedures. Are the payments that they're making appropriate for allowable costs, tying that back to the specific contract. And then when we look at the expenditures, look at whether or not those expenditures are reasonable and appropriate. So, looking at strategic planning, project management, and then actually sampling some expenditures to make sure that the controls they have in place are actually working. The budget we've assigned to this project for the audit team is about 1,870 hours. That would take about a 4 to 5 month window to complete the audit. And we would be able to start the audit immediately. I do have resources available to start 2 or 3 audits immediately. So.
Any other speakers in support? Seeing none. Speakers in opposition, Assemblymember Galgiani.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm here today as the author of AB 3034, which placed the High-Speed Rail Bond Act on the ballot last November. And I want to draw to your attention the fact that AB 3034 already requires that a periodic audit be made of the expenditures by the High-Speed Rail Authority after they are made. We went to great lengths last year in crafting this legislation with the assistance of Senator Lowenthal to ensure that we had stringent accountability measures in the Bond Act. And I would point out to you that of any infrastructure bond that has ever been passed in the state of California, AB 3034, the High-Speed Rail Bond Act, had the most stringent control measures and accountability measures in place of any project. It requires legislative approval before any funding is guaranteed. It requires the creation of an independent peer review committee that consists of individuals with experience in building high-speed trains and running a commuter system and finance and so forth. And that peer review committee is charged with reviewing any of the High-Speed Rail Authority's plans that are submitted before they procure any money for any part of the project. Third, it requires that prior to any request for an appropriation, that they submit a detailed funding plan to the Department of Finance, to the peer review committee, to the heads of each of the budget committees, and to the policy committees. And this finance plan must have detailed information about exactly how the money will be spent. That's before asking for the money. Once the money is appropriated, they must again go through another review period where the plans are submitted to the Department of Finance and so forth. I have a letter before you that details who receives this information and at what points in time that is done. Also, as I mentioned earlier, AB 3034 requires that the High-Speed Rail Authority's expenditures be audited on a periodic basis. So I believe that the request to do the audit today is a duplication of what will already occur under the law. I want to point out to you that tomorrow the Federal Railroad Administration will be here to meet with the High Speed Rail Authority to go over plans for our application for federal funding from the stimulus funds. We are in a position to receive between $3.5 and $4 billion for high-speed rail and an additional $2 billion for conventional rail. So California is at the front of the line because we were the only state out of 9 that has a high-speed rail bond act in place where we have committed funding. And I think that at this point in time, we should allow the High-Speed Rail Authority to channel all of their energies into creating the best possible competitive application that California can present to the federal government. We are in desperate need of these stimulus funds. We're in desperate need of these jobs. I think we need to allow the authority to do their work, to present the most competitive application, and to let the High-Speed Rail Bond Act and AB 3034 do the work that they were intended to do, which is to allow an audit at a more appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblymember Galgiani. And if you could stick around for the questions, we have several members that have questions, but I just wanted to make sure that I allowed any public comment. Are there any other speakers in opposition to this request? No. Then I have Assemblymember Garrick, Senator Wolk, and then Assemblymember Hagman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Real quickly, how long has the High-Speed Rail Authority been in existence?
Over 10 years, 11 years.
Have you ever been audited?
No.
Thank you.
Senator Wolk.
Assemblymember, I wanted to first say that I'm aware of your leadership in this area, and I agree with you that the requirements that you've put into 3034 are unusual and frankly should be part of any bond, frankly, and aren't. They should. But I have a question. What I understand the auditor being asked to do is to audit the systems that are in place. And I don't see that here. I see a lot of good things and a lot of necessary oversight by the HSRA, but I don't see an analysis, an auditing of the systems in place, essentially. Now, did I misunderstand that? I mean, that's what you're planning on doing.
Correct.
Yeah, the objectives in the audit go beyond testing expenditures.
Correct.
And I'm apologize, I'm not extremely familiar. I know I have some language in here related to, traditionally when we're put in a bond measure, we're asked to we track that bond based on the work we do at the state treasurer's office as part of financial audit. So we know when bonds are being issued, and then once a certain amount of bonds are issued, then it's time for us to get in there and start testing expenditures. That's one specific area. This audit analysis and request, as I understand it, is going beyond that. It's looking at the structure of the authority, project management systems, strategic plan, et cetera. So it's over and above just looking at expenditures.
Okay. And the Assembly member raised the issue of the fact that this will take an incredible amount of time away from what really should be the focus right now, and that is using our position, having passed the bond, to really get in line and ready for federal funds and use that appropriately. Tell me about the time that it takes for you to do this kind of audit.
Well, the hours that we've estimated is close to 1,900 hours. That would be about a 4 or 5 month audit. But what that would require is our staff to go in, interview, get familiar with the structure, interview the appropriate individuals, and then obtain documentation. And staff would be doing some audit testing as far as give us your strategic plan. Okay, show us how you're measuring the strategic plan, and then my staff would be doing analysis. When we're in auditing entities, what we try to do and what our staff are instructed to do is, let's not, to use terminology, nickel and dime people. You sit down, you do your full analysis, develop your list of questions, and then approach the administrator of that particular program and say, I need an hour of your time to go through these questions. So we try to be efficient in our process because we understand anytime we're in auditing any agency, it's an additional burden, so to speak, on them. So we try to be respectful of that, but we certainly will need staff's time to answer questions and provide us some upfront information for us to get started in conducting the work.
You said 1,900 hours for your staff.
That's for my staff.
Can
that's
you
correct.
estimate what would happen? You know, you're going to get your questions ready and do your analysis and due diligence, and then you go talk to them. So how much time does it take? Can you estimate that they will be spending in respond?
Well, it depends upon. It's difficult to answer that question. It depends upon how the quality of the records. If they say, "Here's our strategic plan, and here's our quarterly analysis of the goals and objectives that we have assessed, and here's our process," then that won't take much of their time at all. They'll be handing it off to us. We'll be doing the analysis as we're asked to do in the audit request, and then check back in with them. So, again, it depends upon how strong their records are at any agency we go into. If they're poor record keeping, then we're going to be constantly meeting with administrators at that agency saying, okay, you've given us this, it doesn't really look like a strategic plan, or yeah, we've got the strategic plan, but where's the other piece of it? So it really does depend on the quality of what we find when we get in there.
If I could respond to that, I'm glad that you raised that question, because while it seems that it might not take too much time on behalf of the authority, I do wish to point out to you that the authority has been working without any funding from this legislature for how many months, Mr. Morshed?
That was about 7 or 8 months, but as of April 7th, we actually have received funds.
Yes, and in April, we approached the Pooled Money Investment Board and asked for an infusion of cash from bond fund sales so that the authority could continue their work. Mr. Morshed has been working without pay for months. Contracts were not paid because of the state's cash flow problems. I would suggest to you that the state's cash flow situation has really put a tremendous burden on the authority thus far this past year. And we're in a position where we're competing for $6 billion that the state so desperately needs. And I think that to conduct an audit and to ask the authority to go through an audit, which automatically has a negative connotation in the public eye, during the time when we're trying to compete for funding from the federal government, I think it really sends the wrong message. And I don't believe that we're going to gather any information that's going to change anything that we're going to do that's going to be constructive for us going forward. As I mentioned, AB 3034 requires an audit after bond funds are expended. And there's so many control measures in place going forward that I think we need to allow that to do its work. The Federal Railroad Administration will be here tomorrow meeting with the authority. On June 17th, they're going to be releasing the criteria for states to submit their applications, so we will have a very short window of time to work in so that we can put together the most competitive application. And in August, the federal government will receive California's application. I think that we're best served to let the authority continue doing its work now that we have finally gotten the cash infusion that we needed to allow it to continue. And I remind you that that money was just received last month.
Assemblymember Hagman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Rail Authority has been in existence for 10 years, and I'm just wondering what has been the budget for the last 10 years of that, roughly?
Over the last 10 years, we have spent, I believe, close to about $50 million.
About $50 million?
Not including this fiscal year.
Okay, thank you. And I think from previous testimony, we heard from the auditor that when systems that are normally wouldn't be audited get bigger chunks of dollars, that would be the prime example, the high-risk areas, to do a system check before they get the money to put it in place, not just after it's been expended, because these agencies have not been in the position to spend those type of dollars on a regular basis. So this is kind of similar to the transportation one. I believe what we just heard in testimony earlier that was suggested that we should do these audits. And, I think the public also sent us a lot of message last week that they expect our oversight ability to be used in these type of situations when the money's come in. Has the systems that have been put in place for this bond money when it's accepted and funded, have they been approved through like other normal channels, like other agencies, the way they've been used it, or has the authority itself built these systems?
The systems are contained in Assembly Bill 3034, and some of that information is in the letter that I placed before you. Every step of the way, the authority will have to have approval from a legislative body of one type or another. Prior to asking for an appropriation of funds, they have to go through a lengthy process where they submit financing plans, etc., to the independent peer review committee that will have an independent analysis done and submitted to the legislature for review. That's before they even ask for the appropriation. And once the appropriation is made, again, they will have to submit information that details any material changes from the initial information that was provided and have approval again. And I will tell you that AB 3034 passed with a 2/3 vote of this body last year. So it had very, very extensive review at that time. We had a lot of input in crafting the accountability measures that are in place in this bill. And as I said earlier, it has the most stringent accountability measures of any infrastructure bond that this state has ever passed.
Thank you, Ms. Galciani. Assemblymember Cotto.
So I'm trying to understand what the issue here. The issue is that I heard two comments. One, is it going to delay our ability to apply for those federal funds?
I believe it does.
You think that it would?
I believe it will.
And then the second thing, that it would send the wrong message. In what way would it send the wrong message?
I think that anybody has a negative connotation about an audit. It raises question about an agency's ability to do the work that's being done. And usually, particularly in the media's eye, it is not well received by the public. And at this point, we're trying to go to the federal government with one voice, one strong voice, and be competitive with the 9 other states that are competing for the same funding. I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot.
You have the same feeling?
I
can't
comment. I don't know what the connotation is or what the public is going to view. All I can comment is that, as I said earlier, we believe we've been a good stewards of public fund. We believe we've accomplished a great deal, and we don't have any reservation or problem with the auditor looking at us and finding what we did right and what we did wrong.
The request has been moved and seconded. I'd like to just address the negative connotations issue. As the Joint Legislative Audit Committee, us being the ones trying to be proactive and trying to make sure that controls are in place in advance so that we're not spending the money and then going back and looking at the accountability is part of what we just spent an hour discussing as our priorities as a committee, is to make sure that we're being accountable in advance. And I hear the concerns that we absolutely don't want to get in the way of a competitive process of trying to get the paperwork done to get the federal stimulus funds, because if we don't get the money, then it's putting the controls in place for the money we never receive is possibly a waste of time. But what I'd like to ask the auditor about this request is... Yes, but I'd like to ask the auditor to answer a question for us first. That is the timing of this audit request. If we do approve this audit request, is there a way to ensure that the auditor's office does not get in the way of California competing for the federal stimulus funds?
Certainly, we would be sensitive to that. The last thing the state auditor's office wants to do is preclude or inhibit, inhibit the state of California from applying for stimulus money. But I also think that there is value in doing something up front. We certainly would be cognizant of that. That may delay the chronological time for us to complete the job. If we feel we need to step back and the authority needs a couple of weeks, we can't even have your staff here for a few weeks right now. Okay, we'll back off. Give us information. We'll come back to our office in Sacramento, work there, and when the authority feels that they have time, that's why in answering Senator Wolk's question, we will do everything we can to be cognizant of the constraints and the priorities that the authority has. So we will do everything we can to be respectful of that situation.
Senator Wolf, do you still have a question?
I was going to ask if it makes any sense to just direct you to begin September 1st.
We certainly can do that. If the committee chooses to approve the audit and directs my office, wait until they've submitted their application for the stimulus funds, we can do that. And we have it in our queue of audits that we would commence, and we start it in September. That works fine.
Senator Huff, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, if I could just have a brief closing. I think there's a little confusion about what we're trying to accomplish here. And certainly Senator Walk and the chair have spoke to that issue as well as the auditor. But I want to be clear about this. Both Senator Lowenthal and I supported, the bill. We support the project. We want to make sure that it is set up properly. The systems are in place to protect the taxpayers' money, because we have $9 billion now. It build out, this would be $40 billion. It'll be the highest capital project in the state's history. And we want it to be successful. This is about making it successful, not trying to peel it apart from the beginning. As far as the delay, if an audit was commenced with today, it would be not completed until after the stimulus money is granted. And to the degree that, we can delay it until after that, we don't have any problem with that. We just want to see this in place. In fact, President Obama has made clear he wants to have transparency and accountability on the federal stimulus money. So this would help let them know that we have our own house in order and we will manage those funds adequately. And then as far as the wrong message, I think it goes back to how you message it. If we are trying to set up good systems to make sure that the taxpayer funds are protected, we're not going after any impropriety. We don't believe that's been there. And if there is, as Mr. Morshad has said, if there is some issues there, they welcome getting that straightened out so that we are on the correct foot as we move forward. So with all of that, I appreciate your input and ask for your aye vote.
The motion was to approve the audit request as stated. Mr. Duvall, since you made the motion, do you want to change that to allow this audit to go through a different time, or do we want to vote only on?
The author is okay with it. I don't have a problem with it, Bob.
Yeah, I don't know.
With the suggested modification, I'll move it.
September 1st.
Is there a second to moving this audit request to taking the vote now but having it not commence until September 1st?
Okay. Huber?
Aye.
Huber, aye. Kodo? Kodo, aye. Duvall? Duvall, aye. Evans? Garrick? Garrick, aye. Hagman? Hagman, aye. Monning? Monning, aye. Ashburn? Cogdill? Cogdill, aye. Ducheney? Dutton? Padilla? Wiggins? Aye. Wiggins, aye. Wolk?
Aye.
Wolk, aye. We need a Senate vote.
It's on call. There's still one senator needed to vote for the request.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more senator.
Just for the information of the public, because the Joint Legislative Audit Committee is made up of members of both houses, it does take 4 senators and 4 assembly members to approve an audit. It is not just a straight 8 votes to approve an audit. So we are waiting for an additional senator, so it'll stay on call until we receive another senator. With that, I'd like to bring our next request, also for the public information. It was noticed that there was file number 2009109 for Senators Leno, Yee, and Assemblymember Cotto on the California Family Court System. That request was pulled by Senator Leno's office and moved to the June 24th hearing. So we will now proceed with file number 2009112 by Assembly Members Liu and Bell on Medi-Cal treatment authorization request process.
Nice to meet you.
You may present.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members. The Treatment Authorization Request, or TAR, is Medi-Cal's prior authorization process. For certain treatments, a treating physician must file a TAR and then wait for the program to respond whether the treatment is approved. The combination of limited physician participation in the Medi-Cal program and an overly burdensome treatment authorization and billing process has created a roadblock for many patients in need of care. The number of patients receiving Medi-Cal is growing while access to physicians is decreasing and treatment is being postponed and denied. In order to correct this problem, it is crucial that the state take advantage of opportunities to simplify administrative processes and reduce unnecessary red tape. Physicians often argue there are long delays in For these reasons, I request the state auditor to perform an audit of the Medi-Cal TAR process. I have witnesses here in support.
We have a motion and a second. Can we, if your co-author would like to present, we can also allow him.
Please vote for this. Don't mess it up, man. Calderon ain't here. He's out there.
If the auditor could provide some information on this audit request.
Certainly. I'll go through the scope and objectives very quickly. There are just a few objectives the members are asking us to address. First, looking at policies and procedures for administering the TAR process, looking at the criteria for the variety of different types of medical services that require pre-authorization. They're also asking us to look at the criteria used to either approve or deny or reject a TAR. And then there are a variety of medical codes for the different types of procedures that require pre-authorization. So really looking at the policies and practices, how the department approves or rejects these TARs. In addition to that, asking us to look at healthcare services and what the costs have been to administer this program over the last 5 years. Just to give you some information, we did some work in this area. It's been quite a long time, and it was very specific to drug TARs, so we do have some experience in this area. This audit is asking us to look a little bit more broadly, not just look at pharmaceuticals, but look at medical services as well. Another objective is asking us to inquire of the department as to whether or not they've done a cost-benefit analysis of the TAR process. If they have, what were the recommendations that came out of that, perhaps for efficiencies, if the department has implemented any of those recommendations. So really kind of a fact-finding question as to whether or not there has even been a cost-benefit analysis. And then the last objective is looking over a 2-year window and identifying the average amount of time it takes for the department to either approve or reject a TAR, and do this by provider category. There are a variety of providers that are required to get this pre-approval. And then once we determine that, try to categorize by the most commonly and least commonly rejected TARs and reasons why those TARs have been rejected, looking at the criteria that Healthcare Services is using. The audit is budgeted. Again, the audit team would need about 1,700 hours. This audit would take us probably about 4 months based on those hours. So I'm open to any questions members may have.
First, let's have the departments speak on the audit request. Anyone here to speak on behalf of the department? Thank you.
Good morning, members. Chair, hello, thank you. I'm Katie Truworthy. I'm the Director of Legislation for the Department of Healthcare Services. And I'm mainly here to answer some questions. I also have with me Doug Robbins, who is the Division Chief for the Utilization Management Division that oversees the TAR process. So I'm here to answer mainly questions, but I did want to speak a little bit to respect of the TAR process. And, you know, we do understand, and we've heard from providers and hospitals, the various concerns that we have. And we've been doing some proactive things on our own that Doug can speak to. But I did want to make sure that people understand the reason we have a TAR process. The main reason that we have the TAR process is to ensure that beneficiaries are receiving the appropriate medical care, but at the same time ensuring that the state is not overspending general fund. We do have a responsibility in ensuring that the general fund dollars are appropriately spent, and the Utilization Management Division, that's their primary responsibility. It's also a way of preventing fraud on the front end. So, for example, one of the benefits of the TAR system that I'd like to talk a little bit about is the Oxycontin drug. Oxycontin drug, as we've all heard in the media and all in the news, lots of fraud, lots of people buying it and then selling it on the street. I think it was going for $8 a pill. So we recently were able to put Oxycontin on the TAR, requiring a TAR. Now, why is that? Because there are people, there are beneficiaries that really do need Oxycontin. So we don't want to take away something just because there is an abuse of the system. but at the same time, we need to ensure that there are adequate controls. So I just want to say that we recognize providers and hospitals have issues, and so I'm going to turn it over to Doug, who can talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been doing sort of on our own proactive aspect. And then I'm happy to answer some of the questions that are in the agenda as well after Doug.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much. I just wanted to hit on a few issues that we have been doing, as Katie mentioned, in a proactive basis to try and improve and make our TAR processing practices as efficient as possible. One thing that we've done is we have an e-TAR, or electronic TAR function, which allows providers to submit TARs to us electronically so that they can be submitted to us much more rapidly, and we have the ability, once we receive those, to distribute them electronically to our different field offices, so that if one field office is having a backlog, we are able via our surge system, it's called, to electronically redistribute those TARs so that we can get them where we have the most resources so that we can address them as quickly as possible. Another thing we've done over the past couple of years is consolidate our TAR appeal process. It used to be a two-level process in which providers first had to do an appeal to the field office, and then after that to our headquarters office. That's been consolidated down into a one-step process with the appeals going directly to our headquarters office. So that makes a more streamlined and a quicker process, both for us and for the providers as well. A third thing we've done is in terms of notifying providers of the adjudication response, that is what the decision was on their TAR. We now have a process called adjudication response, which is can be provided to providers electronically via fax. It does not contain any protected health information. In the past, we had to send back copies of TARs, and we would have to cross out all the protected health information about the beneficiary. This allows us to get the information much more quickly to providers as well. Also, the information on the TAR adjudication decisions is available online for those providers who submit electronic TARs to us. We've also been working with providers and provider associations to do some education about our TAR process and what can be done to help facilitate it on their end to make it an easier process. Just last week, we did a training at the Hospital Association of Southern California on documentation to include with the TAR to make it more likely, hopefully, if it's medically necessary, to be approved by us. We have a follow-up training with other hospitals in Southern California in June, on June 10th. The last item I wanted to touch on is we are currently involved in some what we call TAR recalibration activities. We have 5 field offices that do TARs, medical TARs, and we have 2 pharmacy sections that do the pharmacy TARs. And we are trying to get them to be as consistent as possible in their TAR adjudication processes and decisions. So we are working to make sure that we are getting a level of consistency that we have not had in the past.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're
We
welcome.
appreciate all the additional information and things that, should this audit request get approved, I'm sure would come to light in the report of the auditor's office. I'd like to open it up to public comment for speakers in support of the audit request.
Madam Chair, may I just add one other issue? The one thing I did want to mention is that our current process is based on the surge system, which is a very outdated system that we're currently in the process of updating. And so one of the concerns is that while we might be doing the audit, we are working right now to streamline and modernize the system that the current process works on.
I'm sorry, we do have senators that have to leave right now, so I want to quickly allow for the public comment portion, but we only literally have time for 1 minute on a speaker in support, and then Me Too's, and that's it.
Hi, Ann McLeod, California Hospital Association. We support that this audit go forward. We absolutely think that a cost-benefit analysis is the right thing to do to prove more efficient government spending. It doesn't make sense to invest money in a process that gets a rubber stamp approval 99% of the time. We fully support having a review process. We, want to be able to prove that we're providing adequate care and the responsible care to the patients, but it doesn't make sense to have to submit 4 TARs for 1 inpatient stay and have somebody review it 4 times. Let's submit 1, and we'll open up our records and show you that we provided the adequate care. We're just asking for a more efficient and modernized way to take a look at the TAR program. Thank you.
Thank you. Any Me Too's?
Yes. Ted Mazer, I'm an ENT physician in San Diego, and unfortunately a 20-year but former Medi-Cal provider because of the TAR system and the state cuts.
Thank you.
And okay. Okay, just
Thank you.
very quickly, if I can. This is a lose-lose-lose situation the way the TAR process currently works. It delays patient care, it costs the state an incredible amount of money, and saves virtually nothing on the back end that's ever been shown in a cost-benefit analysis. And it costs physicians time up front, delays in care, and on the back end. It needs revamping.
Thank you. That's all in the audit request, so we have heard those arguments. Any other public comments in support? Any other public comments in opposition? We have a motion and a second. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Huber.
Aye.
Huber, I. Kodo. Kodo, I. Duval. Duval, I. Evans. Garrick. Hagman. Hagman, I. Monning. Monning, I. Ashburn. Cogdill. Cogdill, I. Ducheney. Dutton. Padilla. Padilla, I. Wiggins. Wiggins, I. Wolk. Wolk, I. That's out.
Your audit request is approved. We're going to open up the roll for the first audit request. Senator Padilla on add-on, please. The first audit request is also out.
Thanks for coming up here. Appreciate it.
My stamp was tickled pink when I quit over the TARS.
And then I think the auditor would like to make it as well.
I'm willing to help, and I agree.
Hey, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I remember you coming in one of the meetings that I had before. I was just sitting in on this one, so you did a great job.
Both items on the agenda have passed committee. So with that, we will adjourn the Joint Legislative Audit Committee.